In a quiet, unassuming town nestled between rolling green hills and winding dirt roads, there lived an elderly black woman named Miss Clara. She was a woman of few words but immense warmth, known to everyone in the neighborhood as someone who could brighten even the darkest of days with her gentle smile and comforting presence. Her home, though modest, was always tidy, a reflection of her disciplined nature, and often filled with the rhythmic hum of her sewing machine. For decades, Miss Clara had worked as a seamstress, stitching together dresses, suits, and curtains for people from all walks of life. Each stitch she made carried not just fabric but also pieces of her story. The love she poured into raising her 2 children after losing her husband too soon, the sacrifices she endured to keep food on the table, and the quiet pride she took in her craft. Miss Clara's hands were weathered from years of hard work, yet they remained steady and precise, capable of creating beauty out of scraps. Her customers admired her skill and dedication, often commenting that no one else could mend or create garments quite like she did. But despite her talent and the respect she commanded within her community, Miss Clara rarely ventured beyond the familiar boundaries of her world. She preferred simplicity over extravagance, contentment over ambition. To her, happiness wasn't found in grand gestures or luxurious possessions. It resided in the small joys of everyday life, the laughter of children playing outside her window, the aroma of freshly baked bread wafting through her kitchen, or the soft rustle of leaves swaying in the breeze. But one particular Saturday morning, something stirred deep inside Miss Clara, a longing she couldn't quite explain. As sunlight streamed through her lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the wooden floor, she sat at her kitchen table sipping her usual cup of tea. The house was unusually silent, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath her feet. It was this stillness that prompted her to reflect on her life, on how much she had given and how little she had taken for herself. For years, she had put others before her own needs, ensuring her children had everything they required while denying herself even the simplest pleasures. Now, with her children grown and starting families of their own, Miss Clara realized she had never truly treated herself to anything special. The idea came to her suddenly, almost as if whispered by the wind sneaking through her slightly ajar window. She thought about the restaurant downtown, the one everyone talked about but only a select few ever visited. Le Gourmet, they called it, a place where wealthy businessmen conducted deals, couples celebrated anniversaries, and socialites flaunted their latest designer outfits. Miss Clara had seen pictures of it in local magazines, gleaming chandeliers, pristine white tablecloths, and waiters dressed in crisp uniforms gliding effortlessly between tables. It was a world far removed from hers, a realm of opulence and exclusivity that felt more like a dream than reality. Yet, as she sat there contemplating, the notion of visiting such a place began to take root in her mind. At first, the idea seemed absurd. What would someone like her, a simple elderly black woman with calloused hands and faded dresses, do in a place like that? Surely she would stick out like a sore thumb among the polished patrons and impeccably dressed staff. But then again, why shouldn't she go? Hadn't she earned the right to experience something new, something beyond the confines of her ordinary life? After all, hadn't she spent her entire existence giving to others without asking for anything in return? Perhaps it was time she allowed herself to indulge, if only for a single afternoon. With newfound resolve, Miss Clara rose from her chair and headed toward her bedroom. There, tucked away in the back of her wardrobe, hung her best Sunday dress, a modest floral number with tiny buttons running down the front. She hadn't worn it in years, not since her daughter's graduation ceremony, but today felt like the perfect occasion to bring it out once more. Carefully, she slipped it on, smoothing out the wrinkles with her palms. Next, she retrieved her old leather purse, polishing it until it gleamed faintly under the light. Finally, she stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the scarf tied neatly around her neck. Though she didn't possess expensive jewelry or designer accessories, Miss Clara exuded a quiet elegance that transcended material wealth. She looked at her reflection and nodded approvingly. Yes, she decided, she was ready. As she stepped outside, the cool morning air greeted her like an old friend. The streets were alive with activity, children chasing each other down sidewalks, dogs barking excitedly behind fences, and shopkeepers arranging their wares in storefront windows. Miss Clara walked slowly, savoring every moment of her journey. With each step, she felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation bubbling within her chest. Would the people at the restaurant accept her? Would they judge her for being out of place? These questions lingered in her mind, but she pushed them aside, focusing instead on the adventure ahead. When she finally reached the entrance of Le Gourmet, her breath caught in her throat. The building was even more magnificent up close, its towering glass doors reflecting the golden rays of the sun. A valet stood nearby, ready to whisk away luxury cars, while elegantly dressed individuals strolled past, their laughter echoing softly in the crisp air. Miss Clara hesitated for a moment, clutching her purse tightly as she reminded herself why she had come. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders and stepped forward, determined to embrace whatever lay ahead. Little did she know, this decision would lead to an encounter that would challenge her perceptions and those of others in ways she could never have imagined. Miss Clara pushed open the heavy glass doors of Le Gourmet and stepped inside, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nervousness. The restaurant was even more breathtaking than she had imagined. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting soft golden light over the room. White tablecloths draped perfectly over round tables, each adorned with gleaming silverware and delicate flower arrangements. The air carried a faint scent of roasted garlic, fresh herbs, and something sweet, perhaps chocolate or vanilla, that made her mouth water instantly. Classical music played softly in the background, adding to the elegant atmosphere. It was a world unlike anything Miss Clara had ever experienced, and for a moment she felt as though she had stepped into a dream. But not everyone seemed to share her sense of wonder. As she approached the host stand, a young man looked up from his clipboard. His eyes scanned her quickly, taking in her modest floral dress, polished but worn purse, and sensible shoes. A flicker of judgment crossed his face before he masked it with a polite yet distant smile. "Good afternoon," he said, his tone clipped and formal. "Do you have a reservation?" Miss Clara shook her head gently, clutching her purse tighter. "No, I don't," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "I thought I'd try walking in." She offered him a small, hopeful smile, hoping he might understand that this was a special occasion for her. But the young man's expression remained unchanged. He sighed audibly, glancing at the nearly full dining area behind him. "We're quite busy today," he said, his words dripping with thinly veiled impatience. "Let me see what I can do." For a brief moment, Miss Clara considered leaving. The weight of the young man's dismissive attitude pressed down on her, making her feel out of place and unwelcome. But then she reminded herself why she had come, to experience something new, to step outside her comfort zone, and to prove to herself that she deserved this just as much as anyone else. Squaring her shoulders, she waited patiently while the host glanced around the room, clearly searching for the least desirable spot to seat her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the young man gestured for her to follow him. He led her, past rows of elegantly dressed patrons who barely noticed her presence, their conversations flowing effortlessly over glasses of wine and plates of gourmet food. Miss Clara couldn't help but notice the subtle differences between them and herself. Their tailored suits, sparkling jewelry, and confident demeanors stood in stark contrast to her simple attire and quiet demeanor. Yet, she held her head high, refusing to let self-doubt creep in. The host stopped abruptly at a small table tucked away in a dim corner near the kitchen doors. It was clear that this was not a prime location. The lighting was poor, and the constant bustle of servers rushing in and out of the kitchen created a distracting hum. Still, Miss Clara thanked the young man graciously as he placed a menu in front of her and walked away without another word. She sat down slowly, smoothing her dress over her lap and glancing at the menu. The names of the dishes were unfamiliar, written in French with descriptions that sounded both exotic and intimidating. Foie gras, escargot, coq au vin. Words she had heard but never truly understood. As she tried to make sense of the menu, Miss Clara became acutely aware of the stares directed her way. Some were curious, others openly judgmental. A group of well-dressed women at a nearby table whispered among themselves, their eyes darting toward her every few seconds. A man in a sharp suit raised an eyebrow when their gazes met briefly before turning back to his companion. Even the waitstaff seemed to avoid her table, their trays tilting slightly away as they passed by. No one came to take her order, and her water glass remained empty long after she had settled in. Despite the growing discomfort, Miss Clara refused to let her spirits dampen. Instead, she observed everything around her with keen interest, noticing details others might overlook. The way the sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, painting colorful patterns on the walls. The rhythmic clinking of silverware against fine china, creating a symphony of sound. The laughter of a young couple seated near the window, their joy infectious even from afar. These small moments reminded her of the beauty in life, even in places where she didn't quite belong. Time ticked by slowly, and still no one approached her table. Miss Clara began to wonder if she should simply leave, sparing herself further embarrassment. But just as she was about to rise from her chair, a server finally appeared. He was a tall, lanky young man with tousled hair and a harried expression. Without meeting her gaze, he dropped a napkin onto the table and rattled off the day's specials in a monotone voice. "We have lobster bisque, filet mignon with truffle butter, and our signature crème brûlée for dessert," he recited mechanically, clearly eager to move on to the next task. Miss Clara hesitated, unsure of what to choose. "Could you tell me more about the filet mignon?" she asked politely, hoping to engage him in conversation. The server paused, visibly annoyed by her question. "It's steak," he replied curtly, as if explaining it further would be beneath him. "Cooked however you like. Medium rare is recommended." His tone left no room for further inquiry, and Miss Clara nodded silently, deciding to order the dish without additional questions. As the server turned to leave, Miss Clara caught sight of another patron waving frantically for attention. The server hurried over, leaving her once again alone at her forgotten corner table. She sighed softly, leaning back in her chair and observing the scene unfolding around her. The disparity between her treatment and that of the other diners was impossible to ignore. While they were greeted warmly, served promptly, and catered to with care, she remained an afterthought, a relic of simplicity in a sea of sophistication. Yet, amidst the neglect, Miss Clara found herself reflecting on the nature of humanity. She thought about how often people judged others based on appearances, dismissing them without taking the time to understand who they truly were. She thought about the years she had spent sewing garments for wealthy clients, many of whom barely acknowledged her beyond exchanging pleasantries. And she thought about the countless times she had been underestimated because of her age, race, or socioeconomic status. In those moments, she realized that this experience was not unique. It was merely another chapter in the story of her life. Rather than letting bitterness take hold, Miss Clara chose to focus on the positives. She reminded herself that she had dared to step into a world unfamiliar to her, proving to herself that courage could exist in the smallest of actions. She reminded herself that true worth was not determined by the opinions of others, but by the content of one's character. And most importantly, she reminded herself that kindness and grace were weapons far more powerful than any judgment or prejudice. By the time her meal arrived, a perfectly cooked filet mignon accompanied by roasted vegetables and mashed potatoes, Miss Clara's perspective had shifted entirely. The food was delicious, yes, but it was the lessons she had learned that truly nourished her soul. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, knowing that this experience, though challenging, had given her something invaluable: the strength to face adversity with dignity and the wisdom to see beyond surface-level judgments. As she prepared to leave, Miss Clara glanced around the restaurant one last time. The chandeliers still sparkled, the music still played, and the patrons continued their lively conversations. But now, she saw the space differently, not as a fortress of exclusivity, but as a microcosm of society itself, filled with flaws and imperfections yet capable of transformation. With a final nod to the room, She rose from her chair, ready to return to her own world, carrying with her the quiet confidence that comes from standing firm in the face of adversity. Miss Clara's meal at Le Gourmet continued to unfold in a way that was both disheartening and strangely enlightening. The filet mignon, though cooked to perfection, arrived without the warmth of hospitality she had hoped for. The server placed her plate on the table with little ceremony, barely glancing at her as he muttered, "Enjoy your meal," before rushing off to attend to another table. It wasn't just his dismissive attitude that stung. It was the stark contrast between how he treated her and how he interacted with other patrons. At the neighboring tables, he smiled warmly, engaged in friendly banter, and even offered suggestions about pairing dishes with wines. Yet when it came to Miss Clara, his demeanor shifted entirely, polite but distant, efficient yet cold. Despite the lack of attention, Miss Clara tried to focus on the positives. She picked up her fork and knife, cutting into the tender steak. The first bite melted in her mouth, rich with flavor and seasoned expertly. For a moment, she allowed herself to appreciate the culinary artistry behind the dish. But no matter how delicious the food was, it couldn't erase the lingering feeling of being an outsider in this polished world. As she ate, she noticed subtle gestures from the staff that reinforced her sense of isolation. A waiter refilling water glasses seemed to skip her table entirely until she cleared her throat softly, prompting him to acknowledge her presence. Another server accidentally bumped into her chair while carrying a tray, mumbling a quick apology without making eye contact. Each interaction chipped away at her confidence, reminding her that she didn't quite fit into this environment. The diners around her added to the weight of her discomfort. Conversations buzzed throughout the restaurant, filled with laughter, animated discussions, and the clinking of fine china. Couples leaned close to one another, sharing intimate moments over candlelit tables. Businessmen exchanged handshakes and nods, their voices confident and commanding. Meanwhile, Miss Clara sat quietly in her corner, savoring each bite of her meal but unable to shake the feeling of invisibility. She caught snippets of conversation here and there. A woman boasting about her recent vacation, a man bragging about his latest promotion, but none of it resonated with her own experiences. These were lives lived in abundance, worlds apart from the simplicity she cherished. Yet amidst the sea of opulence, Miss Clara found herself observing details others might overlook. She noticed the intricate carvings on the wooden panels lining, the walls, the delicate swirls etched into the silverware, and the way the light danced across the crystal glasses. Everything about the restaurant screamed luxury, yet it also felt oddly impersonal, like a stage set designed solely for appearances. The people seated around her seemed more concerned with projecting an image of success than enjoying genuine connection. Miss Clara thought about her own life, the quiet evenings spent sewing by lamplight, the joy of watching her grandchildren play in her backyard, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with her own hands. Her existence may have been humble, but it was authentic, rooted in love and purpose. In comparison, this world of glittering surfaces felt hollow. As she finished the last bites of her steak, Miss Clara glanced at the dessert menu left on the table. Crème brûlée, chocolat fondant, and fruit tarts tempted her taste buds, but she hesitated. Would ordering dessert prolong the awkwardness of her visit, or would it give her another opportunity to savor the experience, despite the less than warm reception? After a moment of deliberation, she decided to indulge. She raised her hand slightly, hoping to catch the attention of a passing server. When one finally approached, she requested the crème brûlée, her voice soft but steady. While waiting for her dessert, Miss Clara turned her attention to the kitchen doors nearby. Every few minutes they swung open, revealing glimpses of chefs, working tirelessly behind the scenes. She watched as plates were garnished with precision, sauces drizzled artistically, and final touches added before servers whisked them away to eager customers. There was an undeniable beauty in the choreography of it all, a reminder that even in a place like this, hard work remained the backbone of success. Miss Clara felt a pang of kinship with those unseen laborers. Like her, they worked diligently, often unnoticed, ensuring that others could enjoy the fruits of their efforts. Though their roles differed, their dedication united them. When the crème brûlée arrived, it was presented with the same indifference as the rest of her meal. The server placed it on the table without comment, leaving Miss Clara to admire its caramelized sugar crust glistening under the dim lighting. She tapped the surface gently with her spoon, breaking through the brittle layer to reveal the creamy custard beneath. The first spoonful was heavenly, rich, smooth, and perfectly balanced. For a fleeting moment, Miss Clara forgot her surroundings and simply savored the sweetness. Dessert had always been her weakness, a guilty pleasure she allowed herself sparingly. Today, however, it felt like a small victory, a reward for enduring the challenges of stepping outside her comfort zone. But as the initial delight faded, reality crept back in. Other diners began to notice her again, their curious stares returning. Some whispered behind cupped hands, their eyes flickering toward her modest attire. Others pretended not to see her at all, turning their heads slightly whenever she glanced their way. Miss Clara knew what they saw, an elderly black woman who didn't belong in their world of privilege and excess. What they failed to recognize, however, was the depth of her character, the resilience she had cultivated over decades of hardship, the kindness she extended to everyone she met, and the quiet strength that carried her through life's toughest moments. Determined not to let their judgment define her experience, Miss Clara focused instead on the lessons unfolding before her. She thought about the young host who had seated her reluctantly, the server who treated her with thinly veiled disdain, and the patrons who dismissed her as unworthy of their attention. Their actions revealed more about them than they did about her. They exposed the biases and prejudices that lingered beneath the surface of society, hidden behind masks of politeness and civility. Miss Clara realized that these attitudes were not unique to this restaurant. They existed everywhere, perpetuating cycles of inequality and misunderstanding. And yet, she also recognized the power of forgiveness. Holding on to anger or resentment would only weigh her down, while choosing compassion allowed her to rise above. As she paid her bill, carefully counting out the exact amount, including a generous tip, Miss Clara reflected on the paradox of her visit. On one hand, it had been a humbling experience, highlighting the ways in which society often marginalized those who didn't conform to certain standards. On the other hand, it had been empowering, reminding her of her own worth and reinforcing her belief in treating others with dignity and respect. She stood up slowly, smoothing her dress and gathering her belongings. Before leaving, she took one last look around the restaurant, committing the scene to memory. The chandeliers still sparkled, the music still played, and the patrons continued their conversations, oblivious to the transformation occurring within her heart. With a deep breath, Miss Clara stepped toward the exit, ready to leave behind the world of exclusivity and return to the familiar comforts of her own life. But as she reached the door, fate intervened in an unexpected way. A child sitting at a nearby table dropped his spoon, which rolled underneath Miss Clara's chair. Without hesitation, she bent down, retrieved it, and handed it back to him with a warm smile. The boy giggled shyly, thanking her with wide eyes, while his parents looked on in surprise. This simple act of kindness caught the attention of someone else in the room, the restaurant manager, a tall man with slicked-back hair and an air of authority. Intrigued by the exchange, the manager approached Miss Clara, his expression a mix of curiosity and admiration. "Ma'am," he said, extending a hand, "I couldn't help but notice your grace in handling that situation. May I ask what brings you to our establishment today?" His tone was respectful, his words sincere, and for the first time since entering the restaurant, Miss Clara felt truly seen. She hesitated briefly before responding, her voice steady and clear. "I wanted to try something new," she explained, "to step outside my usual routine and experience something different. And while it hasn't been easy, I'm glad I came." The manager listened intently, nodding as she spoke. He asked about her background, her work as a seamstress, and her thoughts on the evening's events. To his astonishment, Miss Clara shared her insights with eloquence and wisdom, painting a picture of a life lived with purpose and integrity. By the time their conversation ended, The manager's initial skepticism had transformed into profound respect. He apologized sincerely for the treatment she had received, vowing to address the issues within his staff. Then, with genuine gratitude, he escorted her to the door, promising to ensure her next visit would be nothing short of exceptional. As Miss Clara stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted her like an old friend. She walked home slowly, her mind replaying the events of the day. What had started as a leap of faith had become a journey of self-discovery, teaching her, and those around her, that true value lies not in appearances but in the content of one's character. And though the road ahead might still hold challenges, as Miss Clara stepped outside Le Gourmet, the cool evening air wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. The bustling sounds of the restaurant faded behind her, replaced by the gentle hum of the town settling into its nightly rhythm. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting soft pools of light onto the pavement as she made her way home. Her footsteps echoed softly against the quiet streets, each step carrying the weight of everything she had experienced that day. Though physically exhausted, her mind buzzed with thoughts and emotions, some bitter, some sweet, but all profoundly transformative. The walk back gave her time to reflect, to sift through the layers of what had transpired inside those gleaming glass doors. She replayed moments in her mind. The dismissive glance of the host, the curt treatment from the server, the curious stares of other diners, and finally, the unexpected kindness of the manager who had taken the time to listen. Each interaction had left an imprint, shaping her understanding of not just the world outside her own, but also of herself. For years, Miss Clara had lived a life defined by simplicity and humility, content to remain within the boundaries of her community. But today she had dared to venture beyond those borders, stepping into a realm unfamiliar and unwelcoming at first glance. And though parts of the experience had been painful, they had also illuminated truths about resilience, dignity, and the power of staying true to oneself. Miss Clara's thoughts drifted to the manager's words as he walked her to the door. His apology had been sincere, his promise to improve staff behavior heartfelt. Yet it wasn't his validation that mattered most to her. It was the realization that her presence alone had sparked change. By simply showing up, by refusing to shrink under judgmental gazes or succumb to feelings of inadequacy, she had forced others to confront their biases. That little boy dropping his spoon had been an unintentional catalyst, yes, but it was Miss Clara's response, a simple act of kindness, that had shifted the tone of the entire evening. In bending down to retrieve the utensil, she hadn't thought twice. It was instinctive, rooted in the values she had carried throughout her life. To her, it was no grand gesture, yet to others, it became a moment of clarity, a reminder of humanity. Amidst superficiality, her pace slowed as she approached a park along her route. The swing swayed gently in the breeze, creaking faintly as if whispering secrets to the night. Miss Clara paused for a moment, resting her hand on the back of one of the benches. She thought about how often people underestimated her because of her age, her race, or her modest appearance. They saw only the surface, the floral dress, the worn purse, the calloused hands, and assumed they knew her story. What they failed to see was the depth beneath, the decades of hard work, the sacrifices made for her children, the quiet strength that allowed her to persevere despite adversity. Today, she had proven to herself that courage didn't always look like loud declarations or bold actions. Sometimes it was quieter than that, choosing to show up, to hold your head high, to extend grace even when none was offered in return. A distant memory surfaced as she stood there, gazing at the empty playground. It was a rainy afternoon, many years ago, when her son James had come home from school upset after being teased for wearing hand-me-down clothes. He had begged her for new sneakers like the ones his classmates sported, convinced that owning them would make him fit in better. Miss Clara had listened patiently, her heart breaking for her child, before sitting him down for a talk. "Son," she had said, her voice firm yet gentle, "shoes don't make the man. It's what's inside that counts. If you carry yourself with pride and treat others with kindness, no one can take that away from you." At the time, James hadn't fully understood her words, but over the years, he came to appreciate the wisdom behind them. Now, standing in the park, Miss Clara realized that those same principles had guided her through the challenges of the day. She had entered the restaurant knowing she might not be welcomed, yet she had carried herself with quiet dignity, refusing to let anyone diminish her worth. Continuing her journey home, Miss Clara passed by familiar landmarks: the bakery where she occasionally bought fresh bread, the library where she borrowed books during long winter evenings, and the small garden where neighbors gathered to share stories and laughter. These places were woven into the fabric of her life, reminders of the connections she cherished most. Unlike the polished but impersonal atmosphere of Le Gourmet, these spaces radiated warmth and authenticity. Here, people knew her not by her attire or her social status, but by her character. They valued her contributions, sought her advice, and celebrated her presence. As much as the restaurant had been a test of endurance, returning to this part of her world felt like coming home, to safety, to belonging, to love. By the time Miss Clara reached her front porch, the sky had darkened completely, dotted with stars that twinkled like tiny lanterns. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it softly behind her. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock in the living room. She hung her purse on the hook near the entrance and slipped off her shoes, padding quietly toward the kitchen. There she poured herself a glass of water and sat down at the table, staring out the window at the moonlit yard. Her reflection stared back at her faintly in the glass, and for the first time that day she smiled, not out of relief that the ordeal was over, but out of gratitude for what it had taught her. That evening, Miss Clara found herself thinking about the future. Would she ever return to Le Gourmet? Perhaps not. The experience had been meaningful, but it wasn't somewhere she needed to prove herself again. Instead, she resolved to continue embracing opportunities to step outside her comfort zone. Whether big or small, maybe she'd enroll in a painting class, try a new recipe, or visit a museum in the city. Whatever it was, she wanted to keep challenging herself, keep growing, keep learning. Life, she realized, was too short to stay confined to the familiar, especially when there was so much beauty waiting to be discovered. As she prepared for bed, Miss Clara reflected on the ripple effect of her actions. The manager at the restaurant had promised to address the attitudes of his staff, ensuring that future guests wouldn't face the same neglect she had endured. That single conversation could lead to real change, not just for individuals, but for the culture of the establishment itself. Similarly, her decision to approach the evening with grace rather than anger might inspire others to do the same in their own lives. Kindness, she believed, was contagious, a spark capable of igniting transformation far beyond its initial reach. Lying in bed, Miss Clara closed her eyes, letting the events of the day wash over her like waves on a shore. She thought about the young boy whose dropped spoon had bridged two worlds, the manager who had listened without prejudice, and the countless faces she encountered daily in her own neighborhood. Each person carried their own struggles, insecurities, and hopes just as she did. And while society often divided people based on wealth, race, or status, moments of connection reminded her that humanity transcended such barriers. Before drifting off to sleep, Miss Clara whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, for the lessons learned, for the strength gained, and for the knowledge that she had made a difference, however small. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, and new chances to shine brightly in a world that sometimes forgot to see the light in everyone. With that thought, she pulled the blanket closer, her heart full and her spirit renewed. The days following Miss Clara's visit to Le Gourmet passed quietly, yet her mind remained alive with the echoes of that evening. Each morning, as she sipped her tea and watched sunlight filter through her lace curtains, she found herself revisiting the moments that had unfolded in the restaurant. The memory of the young host's dismissive glance, the server's curt tone, and the curious stares of other patrons lingered like shadows. But so too did the warmth of the manager's apology, the laughter of the child whose spoon she retrieved, and the quiet strength she discovered within herself. These contrasting experiences had woven together a tapestry of lessons, each thread teaching her something new about resilience, dignity, and the power of grace. Miss Clara's routine hadn't changed much since her outing. She still spent her mornings sewing, her afternoons tending to her garden, and her evenings reading by lamplight. Yet there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a quiet confidence that radiated from her like an inner glow. Neighbors who stopped by noticed it immediately. Mrs. Thompson, who lived 2 doors down, commented on how vibrant Miss Clara seemed during their weekly chat over lemonade. "You look different, Clara," she said, tilting her head thoughtfully. "Like you've got some secret happiness tucked away." Miss Clara chuckled softly, brushing off the compliment with a smile. "Maybe I do," she replied cryptically, leaving Mrs. Thompson intrigued but satisfied. As the week wore on, Miss Clara began to think more deeply about the impact of her actions at the restaurant. She realized that while the experience had been transformative for her, it might also have planted seeds of change in others. The manager's promise to address the staff's behavior wasn't just a polite gesture, it was a commitment to fostering inclusivity and respect within his establishment. Miss Clara wondered if those changes were already taking shape. Were the servers now more mindful of how they treated every guest, regardless of appearance? Did the host greet each visitor with genuine warmth instead of judgment? These questions lingered in her mind, sparking a desire to see the results firsthand. On Friday afternoon, Miss Clara decided to take another bold step. She retrieved the complimentary meal certificate the manager had given her and resolved to return to Le Gourmet. This time, however, her intention wasn't to prove anything to herself or others. It was to witness whether real change had taken root. Dressed once again in her best Sunday dress, she set out for the restaurant, her heart lighter than before. The familiar route felt less daunting now, the streets welcoming her with their usual charm. When she arrived at the entrance, she hesitated only briefly before pushing open the heavy glass doors. Inside, the atmosphere was as elegant as ever, but something felt subtly different. The host stationed near the entrance greeted her warmly, his smile genuine and inviting. "Welcome back, ma'am," he said, glancing at her face with recognition. "We're glad to see you again." Miss Clara blinked in surprise, unsure whether he truly remembered her or was simply trained to be courteous. Either way, his words eased any lingering apprehension she might have felt. He led her to a table near the window this time, not tucked, away in a corner but bathed in natural light streaming through the stained glass panes. As she settled into her seat, she couldn't help but notice the difference in treatment. A server approached promptly, offering her a menu with a friendly smile. "Good evening, Miss Clara," he said, startling her momentarily. How did he know her name? Before she could ask, the server explained. "Mr. Reynolds, the manager, told us about your last visit. He made sure we understood how important it is to treat every guest with respect and kindness." His voice carried sincerity, his eyes meeting hers without hesitation. Miss Clara nodded slowly, touched by the effort to ensure her comfort. For the first time since entering the restaurant, she felt genuinely welcomed, not because of what she wore or who she appeared to be, but because of who she was. The meal progressed smoothly, each course delivered with care and attention. The server checked on her regularly, answering her questions about the dishes with enthusiasm rather than impatience. Other staff members greeted her warmly as they passed by, their smiles reaching their eyes. Even the patrons seated nearby seemed friendlier, nodding politely or exchanging pleasantries when their paths crossed. It was as though the entire ambiance of the restaurant had shifted, becoming less pretentious and more inclusive. Miss Clara marveled at the transformation, realizing that small acts of leadership and accountability could indeed create meaningful change. After finishing her dessert, a decadent chocolate fondant drizzled with raspberry sauce, Miss Clara requested to speak with Mr. Reynolds. The manager arrived shortly, his expression lighting up when he saw her. "Miss Clara," he said, extending his hand. "I'm so pleased you came back. How was everything tonight?" She smiled, her gratitude evident. "It was wonderful," she replied honestly. "Thank you for making sure my experience today was so different from the last." Mr. Reynolds nodded, his demeanor serious yet sincere. "Your visit last week stayed with me. he admitted. It reminded me of why we're here, not just to serve food, but to create an environment where everyone feels valued. I spoke with my team about what happened, and we've implemented training sessions to address biases and improve customer service. I hope you see the difference. Miss Clara listened intently, her heart swelling with pride. I do, she said softly, and I'm grateful for it. Change isn't easy, but it starts with acknowledging the need for it, and you've done that. Their conversation continued, touching on topics ranging from community engagement to personal growth. Mr. Reynolds shared stories of his own struggles with prejudice early in his career, explaining how those experiences shaped his approach to leadership. Miss Clara, in turn, spoke about her life as a seamstress, the challenges she faced raising her children alone, and the joy she found in connecting with people through her work. Their exchange was rich with mutual respect, bridging the gap between their vastly different worlds. When it was time to leave, Mr. Reynolds escorted Miss Clara to the door, thanking her once again for inspiring positive change. You remind me that true elegance comes from within, he said, his voice filled with admiration. I hope you'll come back soon, not as a test of our progress, but as a cherished guest. Miss Clara smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'd like that, she replied. Thank you for seeing me. Walking home under the starlit sky, Miss Clara reflected on the journey she had embarked upon. What had started as a simple desire to try something new had evolved into a profound lesson about humanity. She had entered Le Gourmet feeling uncertain and unworthy, but she left knowing she had contributed to something greater than herself. Through her courage and grace, she had challenged stereotypes, inspired change, and proven that dignity transcended appearances. That night, as she lay in bed, Miss Clara felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The world outside her window was vast and complex, filled with challenges and opportunities alike. But she knew now that no matter where she went or what she encountered, she carried within her the strength to face it all. Her story was far from over, but one thing was certain. She would continue to live authentically, embracing every moment with the same quiet determination that had guided her thus far. The days that followed Miss Clara's second visit to Le Gourmet brought a renewed sense of purpose and joy into her life. She carried the lessons from her experiences like treasures, reminders of how far she had come, not just in terms of stepping outside her comfort zone, but also in understanding her own worth. The restaurant's transformation was proof that even small acts of courage could ripple outward, creating waves of change in unexpected places. Yet, as much as Miss Clara appreciated what had transpired at Le Gourmet, she knew her journey didn't end there. Life was full of opportunities to grow, connect, and inspire, and she intended to seize them all. One sunny afternoon, while tending to her garden, Miss Clara noticed a group of children playing nearby. They were laughing and chasing each other around, their carefree energy filling the air with warmth. Among them was a young girl who stood slightly apart, watching the others with wide eyes but hesitant to join in. Miss Clara recognized her instantly. It was Sophia, the daughter of Mrs. Thompson, who often stopped by for lemonade. Sophia was shy by nature, preferring books to games, and Miss Clara had always admired her quiet curiosity. Today, however, something seemed different about her demeanor. Instead of simply observing, Sophia appeared wistful, as though longing to be part of the fun, but unsure how to bridge the gap. Miss Clara set down her gardening tools and walked over to where Sophia sat on the curb, twirling a daisy between her fingers. "Hello, sweetheart," she said gently, sitting beside the girl. "What's got you so deep in thought?" Sophia looked up, startled by the interruption, then relaxed when she saw it was Miss Clara. "I want to play with them," she admitted softly, nodding toward the laughing children. "But I don't know if they'll let me." Miss Clara smiled warmly, placing a reassuring hand on Sophia's shoulder. "Sometimes it takes courage to step into new situations," she said. "But remember, everyone feels nervous sometimes, even those kids running around out there. All you have to do is take one little step forward and the rest will follow." Sophia frowned thoughtfully, turning the flower over in her hands. "What if they laugh at me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's a risk we take whenever we try something new," Miss Clara replied. "But here's the thing. Most people are kinder than we give them credit for. And even if someone does laugh, it doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. You're brave just for trying." She paused, leaning closer conspiratorially. "Do you want to know a secret? Last week I went somewhere I'd never been before, a fancy restaurant downtown. At first I felt out of place, like I didn't belong. But I stayed anyway because I wanted to prove to myself that I could. And guess what? By the end of it, I realized I belonged exactly where I chose to be." Sophia's eyes widened with surprise. "You went to a fancy restaurant? Alone?" she asked, clearly impressed. Miss Clara chuckled, nodding. "Yes, indeed. And let me tell you, it wasn't easy. But sometimes the hardest things teach us the most valuable lessons." Inspired by Miss Clara's words, Sophia stood up slowly, brushing dirt off her dress. "Maybe I'll go ask them to play," she said, her voice steadier now. Miss Clara beamed, giving her an encouraging pat on the back. "That's my girl. Go on, show them your bravery." As Sophia ran off to join the other children, Miss Clara watched with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. She remembered her own childhood when similar fears had held her back from joining in with neighborhood games. Back then, no one had offered her the encouragement she had just given Sophia. Perhaps that's why she felt so compelled to share her wisdom now, to ensure that the next generation wouldn't feel as isolated as she once had. Watching Sophia laugh alongside the other kids filled her heart with hope, reminding her that kindness and guidance could make all the difference in someone's life. Later that evening, as Miss Clara prepared dinner, she reflected on the countless ways people influenced one another. Her visits to Le Gourmet had taught her the importance of standing firm in the face of judgment, but they had also shown her the power of forgiveness and compassion. The manager's willingness to listen and act had sparked positive change within his staff, just as her simple act of retrieving a dropped spoon had humanized her in the eyes of others. Similarly, her conversation with Sophia reminded her that even the smallest gestures of support could empower someone to overcome their doubts. The following week, Miss Clara decided to expand her horizons further. She signed up for a painting class at the local community center, something she had always wanted to try but never dared to pursue. On her first day, surrounded by strangers, dipping brushes into vibrant colors, she felt a familiar flutter of nerves. Yet instead of retreating into herself, she embraced the uncertainty, channeling the same courage that had carried her through her restaurant visits. To her delight, the instructor praised her natural talent, and several classmates complimented her work. By the end of the session, she had made 2 new friends who invited her to join their weekly coffee meetups. These newfound connections enriched her life in ways she hadn't anticipated. Through conversations with her new acquaintances, Miss Clara discovered shared interests and exchanged stories about their lives. One woman, a retired teacher named Margaret, introduced her to poetry readings at the library. Another, a baker named Louisa, invited her to help prepare meals for a local shelter. Each activity opened doors to new worlds, broadening her perspective and deepening her sense of belonging. Miss Clara realized that stepping outside her comfort zone wasn't about escaping her old life. It was about adding layers to it, making it richer and more meaningful. As weeks turned into months, Miss Clara became a fixture in her community, known not only for her sewing skills, but also for her adventurous spirit. People admired her ability to adapt and embrace change, qualities they found inspiring in someone of her age. Children sought her advice when facing challenges, adults turned to her for wisdom during difficult times, and neighbors rallied around her whenever she needed help. In return, she poured her heart into everything she did, whether it was crafting intricate quilts for charity auctions or mentoring young artists at the community center. Her presence touched countless lives, leaving behind a legacy of kindness and resilience. One crisp autumn morning, Miss Clara received a letter in the mail. It was from Mr. Reynolds, the manager of Le Gourmet. Inside, he wrote about the ongoing improvements at the restaurant, crediting her influence for inspiring lasting change. He enclosed a photograph of the staff holding a banner that read, "Everyone belongs here," along with a personal note thanking her for her role in shaping their mission. Miss Clara held the letter close to her chest, tears welling up in her eyes. She hadn't sought recognition or praise, yet knowing that her actions had made such a profound impact filled her with immense gratitude. That evening, as she sat by the fireplace knitting a scarf for her granddaughter, Miss Clara allowed herself to dream about the future. She imagined Sophia growing up confident and fearless, pursuing her passions without hesitation. She pictured the restaurant continuing to welcome guests of all backgrounds, fostering an environment of inclusivity and respect, and she envisioned herself taking on new adventures, exploring corners of the world she had yet to discover. Life, she realized, was a tapestry woven with moments of challenge and triumph, connection and growth. Every thread mattered, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. When the clock struck 9, Miss Clara put aside her knitting and gazed out the window at the starlit sky. The stars twinkled brightly, their light reaching across vast distances to illuminate the darkness. They reminded her of the countless individuals whose lives intersected with hers, some briefly, others deeply, all contributing to the richness of her journey. She thought about the young host at the restaurant, the curious diners, the child whose laughter had broken barriers, and the manager who had listened with an open heart. Each of them had played a part in her story, just as she had played a part in theirs. With a contented sigh, Miss Clara rose from her chair and headed to bed. As she drifted off to sleep, she whispered a silent prayer of thanks for the lessons learned, the friendships forged, and the knowledge that she had made a difference. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, and new chances to shine brightly in a world that sometimes forgot to see the light in everyone. But for now, she rested peacefully, her heart full and her spirit unshakable. And so, Miss Clara's story continued, a testament to the power of courage, grace, and the belief that true worth lies not in appearances, but in the content of one's character. Through every trial and triumph, she proved that even the simplest among us can leave an indelible mark on the world.